For the first time in modern history, a terrifying financial milestone has been quietly crossed. The United States government is now spending more money just to pay the interest on its national debt than it spends on its entire military apparatus. Let that sink in. A single, compounding expense has overshadowed more than the cost of every aircraft carrier, every stealth bomber, and every soldier, just to service the interest on past borrowing. The math is brutal. We are standing at the edge of a mathematical cliff. It's not a temporary glitch. It's the inevitable result of decades of compound interest. Welcome to Unfiltered Finance, where we dissect the raw, unvarnished truth of the global markets. Today, we aren't going to sell you a fantasy. We are going to look at the cold, hard numbers of the absolute debt spiral that is currently unfolding. We will explore what happens when the Treasury auctions fail and global buyers refuse to show up, along with the true cost of the ultimate generational theft. The bill has arrived. Who is going to pay it? A massive debt bomb is ticking, but history has seen this before. To understand our future, we must look at the graveyard of empires. Every global superpower, from the Roman Empire to the Spanish Armada to the British Empire, enjoyed a period of absolute economic dominance. They held the world's reserve currency. This status grants an exorbitant privilege. It allows a nation to print money and export inflation, effectively using the rest of the world as a limitless credit card. But every single time, without exception, this privilege becomes a fatal addiction. Wars, social programs, and bureaucratic bloat that push the empire to borrow beyond its capacity. When taxation reaches its political limit, the empire turns to debasement. They dilute the gold, they print the paper, and they destroy the currency. Is the US dollar walking this exact same path? Yes. Empires fall when they debase their currency. Let's look at today's math. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the US national debt has skyrocketed past $34 trillion. But the absolute number isn't the real threat. The true assassin is the interest rate. For years, the government borrowed at near 0%. It felt like free money. Then, inflation hit. The Federal Reserve was forced to aggressively hike rates. Suddenly, that $34 trillion mountain of debt became a suffocating liability. When old debt matures, the government can't pay it off. They have to issue new debt to pay the old debt. But now, at much higher interest rates. This is the definition of a debt spiral. The interest payments compound so violently that they begin to consume all other crucial government spending. Higher rates are suffocating the federal budget. So, where does all this new money actually come from? To fund its massive, ever-growing deficit, the United States Treasury regularly holds global bond auctions. They issue Treasury bonds, which is essentially just asking the rest of the world for a massive multi-billion-dollar loan. Historically, foreign nations, especially massive economies like China and Japan, along with massive global pension funds, happily lined up to purchase these government bonds. For decades, they were universally considered the safest, most liquid financial asset on the face of the earth. But today, a tectonic shift is currently happening just beneath the surface of the global financial system. Rising geopolitical tensions and the strategic weaponization of the US dollar have forced foreign central banks all around the globe to fundamentally rethink their entire reserve strategy. As a result, China has been aggressively dumping its US Treasuries and simultaneously hoarding physical gold at a completely unprecedented, historic rate. Meanwhile, Japan, desperately fighting to prevent the total collapse of its own currency, can simply no longer afford to be America's primary and most reliable creditor. So, what exactly happens when the US government throws a multi-trillion-dollar borrowing party and the biggest, wealthiest buyers in the world simply refuse to show up? When demand drops, the Treasury has to offer higher yields to attract buyers. But as we established, the budget cannot survive higher yields. If the market dictates the interest rate, the US defaults. Enter the buyer of last resort, the Federal Reserve. When no one else will buy the debt at a sustainable rate, the Fed creates digital dollars out of thin air and buys the bonds themselves. It is a closed-loop system of financial alchemy. But this illusion comes at a devastating cost to the real economy. This is the harsh reality we analyze here on Unfiltered Finance. You cannot print your way out of structural debt without destroying the middle class in the process. The Fed prints to save the government, but ruins the currency in the process. Can't we just solve this problem by cutting government spending? Let's play a game. Balance the federal budget. You are the president. Your mission is to cut enough spending to stop the debt spiral. But here is the catch. Over 70% of the budget is mandatory. This untouchable chunk includes Medicare, Social Security, and interest payments. You cannot legally cut Medicare or Social Security without committing political suicide. Millions of retirees depend on it. Touch it, and they will vote you out instantly. You can't cut interest payments either, or you default on the global stage. That leaves discretionary spending, and approximately half of that is defense. So, let's assume the impossible. Let's say you dismantled the entire US military and fired every single federal employee across the entire country. Even after doing all of that extreme austerity, you still wouldn't balance the budget. The math is mathematically impossible to solve through austerity alone. The math is impossible. The game is over. So who actually pays for all of this mounting debt? Since the government refuses to cut spending, and taxation alone cannot possibly cover the massive financial gap, the crushing financial burden is quietly and systematically passed down to those who cannot even vote yet. Every single baby born in America today inherits a staggering, invisible financial liability the moment they take their first breath. This is not a dramatic metaphor. It is quite literally the greatest, most devastating generational theft in human history. Generation Z and Generation Alpha are entering a harsh, unforgiving economy that is essentially mathematically rigged against them from day one. They are facing a housing market that is completely unaffordable, where even basic starter homes cost an absolute fortune. They are dealing with stagnant real wages that simply cannot keep up with the compounding, relentless cost of basic existence. Everything from daily groceries to higher education has become a suffocating expense due to the silent, invisible tax of inflation. Metaphorically speaking, the younger generation is essentially being forced to pay a massive, inescapable, and lifelong mortgage on a lavish, beautiful economic house that their parents and grandparents happily lived in for decades, and then completely burned to the ground through deficit spending before finally handing over the useless keys. The brutal, undeniable truth is that the government systematically borrowed the economic prosperity of the distant future, simply to fund the unsustainable comfort, the endless wars, and the empty political promises of the present day. And after decades of sheer financial recklessness and kicking the can down the road, that multi-trillion-dollar bill is finally coming due. The future generation is saddled with an impossible burden. So, will the United States simply declare bankruptcy? Here is the ultimate plot twist. The United States will never officially default on its debt. A sovereign nation that issues its own fiat currency doesn't ever have to miss a payment. Instead, it defaults by stealth. It's a deliberate, historical strategy known as financial repression. The government will intentionally force inflation to run consistently higher than interest rates. If inflation is running at 5%, but your government bonds only yield 2%, the government is secretly wiping away 3% of its total debt in real terms every single year. They are paying off their massive obligations using the diminishing purchasing power of your money. It is a hidden, unvoted tax on anyone who responsibly saves in cash. anyone who relies on a fixed pension to survive, and essentially, anyone who blindly trusts the traditional financial system. They don't have to physically break into your bank account and take your money. They just quietly take away what your money can actually buy. Your wealth doesn't vanish. It is simply transferred to the debtor. The hidden default through inflation is not a new trick. Are we at the end of a cycle? Prominent economic historians have noted a recurring 100-year cycle of wealth and global dominance. A new world order is established. Prosperity grows. Debt accumulates. Wealth gaps widen. And eventually, the debt breaks the system, leading to a massive reset. The transition is never smooth. It involves volatile markets, severe political polarization, and the desperate, rapid debasement of the reigning currency. Right now, the US dollar is still the cleanest shirt in a dirty laundry basket, but its absolute hegemony is visibly cracking. For the rational investor, ignoring these macro-historical trends is no longer an option. Hope is not an investment strategy. The debt spiral is no longer a theoretical warning for the distant future. It is our current, inescapable mathematical reality. The interest payments will only continue to grow, compounding exponentially. But the solution is not to panic. The solution is to adapt. You must understand that fiat currency is fundamentally designed to lose its value over time. Hard assets, scarce resources, and true economic value creation will be your only lifeboats. Do not expect the very institutions that created this structural crisis to somehow protect your hard-earned purchasing power. That responsibility rests entirely on you. Thank you for facing the raw, unfiltered truth with us today. If you value objective, data-driven analysis over market hype, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We will continue to dissect the harsh realities of the global economy. Stay sharp,